We're going to move on to our second panel, Anti-Zionist Theory and Practice. My name is Adrian Zakar. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Our first speaker is Nasser Abourahme. Naser Abourahme is a writer and teacher, currently assistant professor of Middle Eastern and North African Studies at Bowdoin College. He's the author of The Time Beneath the Concrete, Palestine Between Camp and Colony, which is forthcoming next year with Duke University Press, so keep your eyes open. Nasser's work has appeared in Radical Philosophy, Critical Times, Cultural Critique, and Critical Ethnic Studies. Please join me in welcoming Naser Abourahme.
Thank you all. Thank you, Adrian, for that introduction. Can everyone hear me? And let me also extend my thanks to Max and to Asmat for putting this together and for bringing you all here. I've learned immensely from, I think, everyone that's on this program, so it's a real pleasure and an honor, really, to be with you all today. I'm going to make two broad sort of theses or propositions, and I'll probably focus more on the first one, around what I think the anti-Zionist imperative is today. And I'm just going to state them from the outset so that we know where we stand. One, there is no anti-Zionist idea, there is only anti-Zionist praxis. A praxis that I think is both the effect and the condition of the anti-colonial subject. Two, there can be no anti-Zionism that is also not anti-imperialist. And any anti-imperialism today worthy of the name has to be anti-Zionist. I've kind of given you a faulty bill of sales there because I'm going to talk more about the first one than the second one, just because when I sat down to write this week, that's what happened. But I will try to get to the second one, at least by way of conclusion. So one, anti-Zionism as praxis. My main point here is that any meaningful critique or knowledge of Zionism can only ever emerge and indeed be a part of the concrete struggle to defeat Zionism. Not the struggle to reform Zionism or counter its ideological claims, but the struggle to defeat it as a concrete political project. A struggle that is not, in fact, limited, I think, to the defeat of the Israeli state project. And this is what I'll come to at the end. Since Zionism very clearly exceeds that project, one can think of it in terms that I don't think are overblown as a struggle that is, in fact, against and over the world itself, right? And nothing less than the world itself. In other words, much like the knowledge we produce about the carceral system or the border regime today, anti-Zionist knowledge can only ever be abolitional. And like abolitional thought begins with anti-carceral and anti-border struggles, with the worlds and references of the incarcerated and the encamped, so too anti-Zionism must begin with the terrain of struggle on colonized land. And like abolitional thought shows us an otherwise world only visible in the cracks of this one, so too anti-Zionist praxis incites a world just beyond this one. So I mean praxis here, just to be clear, not as practice as opposed to theory, but in a broadly Marxian sense, I think a lot of people will be familiar with, praxis as the form of action from which both theory and the revolutionary subject emerge. And I emphasize this today because I think anti-Zionism is subject to a kind of defanging appropriation. Right? An appropriation that empties it out of its political and its negational force. And I'm interested in its negational force. An appropriation that I think de-regionalizes anti-Zionism and dehistoricizes anti-Zionism, removing it from the much broader traditions and worlds of anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, and what I think is a resurgent third worldism today. In a certain sense, we could say that in these cases, what is invoked as anti-Zionism begins increasingly to look a lot like what used to be called post or non-Zionism, both, I think, terms that are largely meaningless in this current conjuncture. In fact, one could go further and arguably say, albeit somewhat mischievously, I'll concede, that we're at a stage where the death of liberal Zionism might be replaced or resuscitated in some contexts with a liberal anti-Zionism. Right, that is anti-Zionist in name only, in fact, sort of like the anti-fascism of the liberal ruling class that has worked so wonderfully recently. I'm not here talking about the need for instrumental knowledge or thought, right? I'm not even wading, and I don't want to wade into the very tired terms of the relationship or the correct relationship between scholarship and politics. I honestly don't even know how one would begin to pose that relationship from the university today. It may be that it is not posable from the university today. What I'm emphasizing rather through a notion of praxis is that anti-Zionist thought has to be immanent to the actually existing concrete forces of struggle and combat. Immanent, that is, not just to thought and the university, but immanent to the armed struggle in the field, immanent to the prisons of the occupation, to the hospitals and the insurgent doctors, to the forms of re-inhabitation and return, to the sacrifices and the martyrdom. It's from this world, I think, that the conceptual tools and grammar have to be drawn. As such, to expand this a little bit, what I'm saying is that anti-Zionism cannot begin from Zionism's own genealogies or its intellectual history. I just don't think that's where we start. To begin with Zionism's own corpus of knowledge is to risk our ensnarement in Europe or the West's political and epistemic world yet again. And I'm not saying here that we don't read Zionists. The question is about how and from where you read them. In other words, contrary to much of the enduring theoretical and philosophical trends, what I'm also saying in part is that anti-Zionism need not begin with Europe's Jewish question or the tragic melodrama of the figures of the Arab and the Jew. I don't think that anti-Zionism needs to revolve, as would seem to be the suggestion often in these circles, around an ethics of the other. For people invested in this kind of relational ethics as the substance and critique of Zionism, not only is the starting point most often continental philosophy and the ethical failures of people like Levinas or Derrida or Sartre or whatever, who, of course, all infamously failed to recognize the Palestinians as victims. And that was really all that was being demanded of them. But there's also an insistence here that the Palestinian question cannot, in epistemic terms, actually be thought of independently or even to the side of the Jewish question, but rather has to be thought in direct relationship to it. So in this rendition, the Palestinian question doesn't really have substance or content of its own outside of the Jewish question or independent of the Jewish question. A point that Gil Hochberg, to take but one example, leans on Edward Said to make, attributing to him, in her words, a line of flight, and I'm quoting here, towards the Palestinian question, but through the figure of the Jew. At stake here is usually a mutual recognition of suffering, trauma, national narrative as the starting point for what is usually mutuality, ethics, that might one day, no one really knows how one day, but might one day begin to exceed the terms of Zionism. And one iteration of this, I think, today that we see in scholarship is the move to think the Holocaust and the Nakba side by side as historical entanglements, right? And it is in a recent book by Amos Goldberg and Bashir, which is a book I think that has a lot of merits to it, but I think kind of faces an insurmountable sort of obstacle, right? It struggles to overcome a historical and structural asymmetry that is all but unsurpassable. And it kind of gets, I think it's ultimately, at least the introduction is stuck there. With the utmost respect for all of this, I think it is today entirely a dead end for anti-Zionism. Not only because it presents Palestinian anti-Zionism with an almost impossible set of symbolic demands, and I think they are largely symbolic demands. You have to be versed in the intricacies of Europe's Jewish question and in the long shadow of Western Christian anti-Semitism and its many tropes before you can even begin to refuse and resist your own extermination. And not only because at the end of this road, I think the best you really get is the ethical, and not the political, the ethical space of appearance for the Palestinian righteous victim. That is the best we get, essentially, is that which was denied and refused us by Levinas, Sartre, and so on. And I don't really know who cares about that today, but that's what it is. And not only because these relational ethics don't really take us an inch past, even if they don't always put it in these terms, but they don't take us an inch past the moral economy of sentiments proper to humanitarianism. Right? Compassion, tragedy, empathy, and so on, that are no longer simply complicit in violence, but today totally defunct in the face of the Western-mandated post-humanitarian slaughter that is Gaza. But also, I would say, and more consequentially possibly, by taking us back to start with Europe's privileged figures of alterity, it keeps all of us ensnared in Europe, the West, as the historic and epistemic center of even those forms of thought that seek flight away from Europe. By contrast, I think what is needed for anti-Zionism as praxis, in the Fanonian sense, is precisely a radical forgetting of Europe. That our colonizers happen to be Europe's Jews is and must remain at some level irrelevant to us. And I'm irrelevant, really. This is not to foreclose the potential of anti-Zionism as a form of address capable of reaching Israeli Jewish society, but it is to resist the necessity of reading our struggle through the primary prism of the Jewish question, and in turn to resist the conclusion, as some would say, as Raif Zreik did, for example, a few years ago, that it is, quote, the Palestinian fate and destiny to deal with the Jewish question. I mean, this strikes me not only as too impossible a burden, but fundamentally a displacement that effectively lets Europe and the West off the hook. Even as sharp an anti-colonial mind as Edward Said's, and here I tread carefully, of course, but even as sharp as an anti-colonial mind as Edward Said's once glossed the question of Palestine as the entanglement of Jew and Arab in what he called, and these are his words, a magnificently imposing symphony with the sublime grandeur of a series of tragedies, losses, pains, sacrifice that would take a Bach or an Edmund Burke to really fathom. Thankfully, we don't have a Bach or a Burke on hand, as far as I know, because with all due respect to Said, our patron saint, and I don't disavow that for a minute, I think he was wrong with this one, right? This is this very well-known interview he did with Ari Shavit at Haaretz, in which he also claimed he was the last Jewish intellectual. The issue for me here, as it pertains to a politics and praxis of anti-Zionism, is that in the displacement of the terms of the colonial contradiction into Europe's figures of alterity, Arab and Jew, we lose the actual relations of struggle between Palestinian and Zionist. These are not the same, and they're only interchangeable within Zionism's discursive world. The first, Arab Jew, are a pair of overdetermined, mirrored, or parallel figurations that cannot but index Europe's displacement of its racial animus and its historical anti-Semitism. The second are mutually constituted concrete subject positions that cannot but index the fundamental contradiction and differences between settler and indigenous subjectivities at play. For Zionism, the figure of the Palestinian Arab as the racial discard and the object of necropolitical sovereign control is the figure that holds Zionist subjectivity together, right? Zionist subjectivity, the content of Zionist subjectivity is the violence of dispossession, right? That's what its substance is. For Palestinian, but the reverse is not true the same way at all. For Palestinian political subjectivity, both sovereignty and the figure of the Jew, I would contest, are marginal. The foil is not the Jew, it's the settler, and the settler has no content and needs no content other than its settlerness. The contradiction, and in turn the terms of praxis, are the colonial relation itself. I bring this up to emphasize the need for anti-Zionism to hew closely to the existing terms of Palestinian struggle and its political subjectivities. This is not, of course, to forget the long and rich history of Jewish anti-Zionism, nor is it to ignore the immense value of contemporary Jewish anti-Zionism, with all the misgivings that we've heard already from Liron about a framing like that, which I think are very apt. Nonetheless, I think it's a critical front in the struggle today. It is rather to insist on beginning with what we might call the cosmopolitical world of Palestinian resistance. And I think actually, if there is a Western Jewish anti-Zionism, its fate in a certain sense hangs on how it heeds that call, I think, right? I think that's the big question that faces, again, what we might, under sort of duress, call Western Jewish anti-Zionism. How does it relate to the terms of Palestinian struggle? The best resource for thinking about this, to my mind, still comes from Ghassan Kanafani's 1969 novel, Returning to Haifa, because it's precisely this novel that's often read and celebrated as a deeply humanistic rendition of the encounter between Palestinian and Israeli, readings that I think often miss the political thrust of the novel in ways that are instructive, at least here and now, for thinking about anti-Zionism today. So I want to make a very small detour via Kanafani here. The plot of the novel, as I'm sure many of you know, is quite simple. In the weeks after the 1967 war expanded the effective boundaries of the state, of the Israeli state that is, a Palestinian refugee couple, Said S. and Safiya, make a journey back to the Haifa home from which they were expelled in 1948. In that expulsion and the panic that ensued in the city's conquest, Said and Safiya had left their infant baby boy, Khaldun, in the house from which they were forcibly displaced into the West Bank. A Jewish couple, Miriam and Efrat, are then given the house by the Israeli state on the condition that they adopt this seemingly now orphaned baby. And the novel really revolves around this return to their home and the encounter between Said and Safiya, the refugee couple, and Miriam, and the son, Khaldun, now Dov, who enters sort of somewhere, I think midway through the novel, wearing his Israeli military uniform, and in sort of rejecting his biological parents, brings the novel to its sort of dramatic denouement. Now, the novel has been praised, and I think correctly, for its rich picture of the enemy, for quote-unquote the enemy, for having fully formed and complex Israeli-Jewish subjects. And indeed, Kanafani presents an empathetic and rounded picture of the central Israeli-Jewish character in the book, Miriam, who's a Holocaust survivor, a reluctant participant in the colonial project, and who consistently displays forms of doubt and empathy. But the book is not, I think, a story of intersubjectivity, or as one well-known reading had it, a book that shows, and I'm quoting here, how the Israeli and Palestinian narratives of exile and return become interlinked to the point of collapse. Nor is it, I think, an appeal for a recognition of entangled pasts and traumas, the Nakba and the Holocaust, that have to somehow be revisited and mutually accounted for so as to find a way forward. I think what the novel mediates, for me at least above all, is the imperative of anti-colonial praxis as both the imminent ground for thought and self-realization and the opening of futures that are not predetermined by the past. At the dramatic crescendo of the novel is a long monologue delivered by this main character, Said, after, as I said, this sort of disastrous encounter with the biological son. This monologue, which is also, of course, the staging of a kind of failed dialogue, and which begins with Said bursting into at least what the English novel, it's not a very accurate translation, but what it translated as explosive laughter, is also the moment in which Said begins to see the concrete conditions of his historical predicament for the first time. He realizes it was a mistake to return to Haifa now. They have not, in fact, returned home. They have not, in fact, found Palestine, not yet, at least. The past can't be restored, and Palestine can't be recovered in a sort of individual act or in a journey back along the ropes of memory. So he tells Safiya, in what I think some of the most memorable lines of the book, he says, and I'm quoting, "I'm looking for the true Palestine, the Palestine that is more than memories, more than peacock feathers, more than a sun, more than the pencil scribbles on the stairwell. We search for something beneath the dust of memories, and what did we find beneath that dust? More dust." End quote. The homeland, he says a little later, is not a past, it's the future. And the insight here, I think as it almost always is with Kanafani, is that it is only in the turn to action and struggle that the future might be opened. Or as Said again tells Safiya, quote, "Didn't I tell you from the beginning that we shouldn't come, that this is something that will take a war?" End quote. Now, I don't think this is simply a celebration of armed struggle or a sort of the figure of the militant, but rather I think it's an understanding of struggle as part of the unavoidable condition for the very possibility of being a Palestinian or a speaking Palestinian in the world. What Kanafani understood then, and I think what his legacy still bespeaks today, which is why, I don't know, at least I obsessively return to him, but I think many do, is that it is only in struggle, only in the revolutionary ruptural act that a Palestinian subject as the subject of thought, of reflection, or the idea might emerge. This is borne out in the novel most clearly in the incitement of Said and Safiya's other son, Khalid. We know very little about Khalid, and we'll never actually meet him in the novel, but his role is actually quite critical. What we do know is that a week prior to the events of the novels, he wanted to join the armed revolution, only for his father, Said, to forbid it, essentially, and threatened to disown him if he did. Now, in this sort of dramatic denouement at the end of the novel, in this encounter, as Said is completely overwhelmed at his biological son, Khaldun Dov, rejecting him with contempt, he incites Khalid. It's his last actual turn. He has nowhere else to turn but to incite Khalid and to pretend that Khalid has already joined the revolutionaries, to tell Dov, his other son, that one day you may meet in the battlefield. I think what's telling here is the moment of introspection that comes right after that part of dialogue, where Said finds himself thinking to himself, what a strange world. Because of course he's concealing that it was him that had stopped Khalid from joining the revolution. And yet at that moment, Kanafani tells us, he could find no way to defend himself in the face of the tall young man's disavowal other than by boasting of his fatherhood to Khalid, the revolutionary to be, if it will. So in the moment, and I think this is what it's important, in the moment when he teetered in this encounter on a kind of subjective collapse, or really a kind of subjective dissolution, it's only his son's participation in the revolution that allows him to carry on and gather himself as a speaking subject. What Kanafani gives us then, I think, is the anti-colonial subject as neither essence, the human, nor a metaphysical universal memory, longing, love of homeland, but the effect of a practice or an act. or more precisely, the effect of the opening made by the act. In this Palestinian revolutionary tradition, the subject is only ever imminent to the fight, right? It's only ever imminent to the crack or the hole that's made in the order of the given. Khalid Audatullah, in a reading of Kanafani more generally, I think quite correctly says that for Kanafani, the Palestinian is neither memory nor identity, right? The Palestinian is always trial or test, imtihan or mihna. It's only in the trial that the subject emerges. So what Kanafani opens up in the staging of encounter in returning to Haifa is neither the entanglement of competing or overlapping pasts and historical injuries, right? The Arab, the Jew, the Nakba, the Holocaust, nor the possibility of an idyllic return to a restored pre-Nakba past, but actually the imperative of the dialectical overcoming of the present in revolution. In other words, to put it in Marxist terms, Kanafani no doubt would have been familiar with, what he gives us is the imperative of the negation of the negation. It will take a war, as he repeatedly says. This is anti-Zionism as I read it, or anti-Zionist praxis as I read it in Kanafani, the revolutionary negation of the negation that is also the very possibility of a subject. In turn, the anti-Zionist idea in forms of study, thought, reflection can only ever emerge from this praxis. In the conditions of exterminatory violence, to put this differently, the conditions of exterminatory violence, or in the systematic negation of the very possibility of collective existence that is Zionism, the idea needs the rupture, right? It needs the crack or the hole in the order of the given that only praxis can give it. I think Kanafani's insight, at least this insight as I'm reading it, is very much still with us in various forms of the contemporary struggle, I think. This insight, I think, is also there in contemporary Palestinian prison literature. It's there, for example, in the work of the recently martyred Walid Da'a. For Da'a, as for Kanafani and for Sinwar, the prison was a name for the political logic that defines Zionism, right? Again, not a metaphorical relationship. You can be an inmate of the small prison, the actual carceral site, or an inmate of the big prison that is occupied Palestine. The logic of the carceral defines both. And that logic is not simply confinement, it's not simply containment. It's objectification, or in Da'a's words, it's the molding of docile and defeated bodies. In his 2010 book, Molding Consciousness, Da'a tells us that the task of confronting the prison logic begins with a kind of refusal. As a prisoner, he says, you only have two choices. Quote, either you give up on your subjective being and are transformed entirely into the object of your jailer, or you transform yourself into an object of study so as to redefine your suffering and its causes. End quote. The transformation of yourself into an object of study, into what Da'a called both the examined and the examining self, is a kind of praxis. It both depends on and produces events that constitute a break or a hole in the order. Armed struggle is but one name for this hole. It's not the only name. It might be the smuggling of sperm beyond the prison walls to give birth to children. It might be using a spoon, a smuggled lighter, and a hidden bar of chocolate to fashion a dessert for a whole section of inmates confined to solitary isolation. Or it might be crawling outside of the prison walls using nothing more than that same spoon and the literal hole that it digs. The issue at stake here, then, in thinking about anti-Zionist praxis isn't, I think, the uncritical celebration of armed struggle or a fetish of militancy. This is not what I mean when I say start with the political grammar of the Palestinian struggle. The issue, in fact, is the conditions to which this struggle rises. The issue, in short, is the intolerability of the world, right? It's the intolerable condition of the world that stands silent, and much more than that, in fact. The issue is the intolerability of the world and the imperative of fashioning the forms of action that might do something about it. And I want to end here with this intolerability of the world because it'll allow me to make a final, if gestural, connection to anti-imperialism in this context, right? Why have I dwelled on praxis and this arc from Kanafani to Da'a? Well, because I think it's the clearest rendition of the way the Palestinian revolutionary tradition has staked itself, like many traditions in the anti-colonial key, on its capacity to constitute a subject in almost impossible conditions, right? And that's why I'm saying we have to start there. The impossibility of these conditions aren't only the nearly insurmountable odds that these struggles face, right? It's not only that you face an enemy with infinite more capacity, right? with technological superiority, with military superiority, with dromological superiority. It's also the fact that at some level, you're up against the order of the world itself. Right? To be the Palestinian subject, the subject of the refusal of Zionism, is at some level to oppose the world itself. I think for me that's the clearest conclusion I arrive at from the genocide and the necessity of the genocide to Western-led global order. Right? I think that's what defines it above all. And I think so. I think those stakes become very clear over this year. Zionism, in other words, is not just the name for the garrison outpost of US-led imperialism at the heart of an Arab world, and an Arab world that has historically been integrated into global capitalism, of course, precisely through war and militarization, right? Which is something people miss, that it is destruction and ruination that are actually the conditions of accumulation in that part of the world, and not stable social reproduction or whatever. Zionism is not just this. Zionism is also at the core of the ideological order that is the post-war imperial West, right? So it has this, and I don't want to make too stark a distinction between its imperial function in a sort of, material military sense and its ideological function, but I want to try to think about them nonetheless, separately a little bit. Zionism is the post-Holocaust and post-colonial West's ideological alibi, the terms of its moral absolution, the exception that proves the rule of the West's transition to a rules-based, liberal, humane, and humanitarian post-war order. How am I doing? 5 minutes. To put it somewhat schematically, it's not just that the West makes Zionism possible, but also that Zionism makes the West as a white civilizational moral order after the Holocaust and after the high noon of colonialism possible. So, for example, when they say, that genocide is, of course they don't call it genocide, but when they say the war is in defense of Western civilization and values, I think one should take them quite literally and at face value. Zionism then has come to stand in for the rights not just of settler colonialism and racial nationalism everywhere, but also for Western civilization's right to foreclose any kind of reckoning with ongoing colonial historical injustice anywhere in the world. Indeed, what's being crushed in the Western mandated, and I don't think it's just Western supported, I think it's Western mandated annihilation of Gaza, and what is being counterposed in the resistance on the ground is once again the demand for a genuinely decolonized world. This is why, for so many of us, it feels like a both past and future rolled into one. What this means is that at some level, it's not only in the eyes of the Zionist settler state that Palestinians had to be made to disappear. The world itself, in some sense, also demanded the same. The negation of the Palestinian itself would appear necessary for the very viability of a Western-led order. Then insofar as the figure of the Palestinian denotes the subject enacted in the refusal of Zionism in any shape or form, the Palestinian might be the last inassimilable remainder in the West. This is why I've insisted here on not beginning with Europe's figures of alterity or with relational ethics, but with the world of Palestinian struggle and its political subject. Because I think it's in this world that is also a condition of worldlessness in its own right. It is a world that has no place in the world. It is in this world that we might glean a little of what it means to rebel against the intolerability of the world today, or to glean how the child faces a tank with stones in their hand only so as to learn how to speak. Thank you very much.
As you wish, but please, welcome to stay. Thank you, Nasser. That was great. Thank you. Now I want to call on stage Daniel Boyarin. Daniel Boyarin is the Taubman Professor Emeritus of Talmudic Culture and Rhetoric at UC Berkeley. He received his PhD in 1975 from the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. He's been an NEH Fellow twice, a Guggenheim Fellow, a Fellow for the Institute for Advanced Studies in Jerusalem, a holder of the Berlin Prize at the American Academy in Berlin, and a Ford Foundation Fellow. He spent the academic year of 2012 and 13 as a Fellow of the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin and was the von Humboldt Forschung Preisträger at the FU Berlin in 2017. He's a fellow at the American Academy of Arts and Science since 2006. Boyarin has written extensively on Talmudic and Midrashic studies and his work has focused on cultural studies in rabbinic Judaism, including issues of gender and sexuality, as well as research on Jews as a colonized and a colonizing people. In his recent research interest, he centered primarily around questions of the relationship of Judaism and Christianity in late antiquity and the genealogy to the concept of religion in Judaism. His most recent book is The No-State Solution, a Jewish Manifesto, published by Yale University Press in 2023. Please join me in welcoming Daniel Boyarin.
Is the mic working? Okay. I have a paper, but I left it there on the desk because I don't feel moved at this moment to further articulate, specify, or comment on my earlier work on the no-state solution. Which is what I had planned to do. Instead, I want to address, and you can literally stop me whenever you need to, and maybe even sooner. What I want to address some of the terms that have been raised in the papers that we have heard, the three extraordinary papers, and they are all extraordinary. Perhaps one measure for me, narcissistically, is the amount of discomfort that I have managed to feel. At the same time, I think perhaps I don't need to say, that's my phone. In a moment of deep solidarity, deep and heartfelt solidarity with much of what I've been hearing. So I'm going to start off at perhaps what is the easiest point for me, which is to talk about, for a moment, anti-Zionism as a Jewish movement. And the reasons why, and I don't think it's just in the United States, I don't think it's peculiar to the United States, why perhaps, if I were writing a lexicon, the first meaning that I would give to anti-Zionism in the lexicon would be a Jewish resistance against the Zionist idea, the idea that Zionism, or that the establishment of a state, of a Jewish state, was in any sense a viable, meaningful solution to what I will continue to call the Jewish question. I call it the new Jewish question. And that praxis of resistance, and it is praxis also, precisely in the sense that you articulated it. It drives me crazy to hear people talking about theory and praxis, as if praxis was just like wearing black clothes or going out to smoke, sign that you were somehow smarter than everybody else who just says practice. But praxis in that precise sense of the relay between linguistic practice and other forms of practice, between words that are stones and stones that are words. I want us to maintain that, because that is what, in a sense, gives viability, or any kind of viability, any kind of respectability to what I imagine, I'm fantasizing, most of us do in our daily lives, which is think, talk, and write. So anti-Zionism, in that sense, is I'm going to adopt an old trope, right? Anti-Zionism is the theory, and certainly at this moment, any form of possible support for the Palestinian struggle is the practice that grows out of that theory. And it is a movement in that sense, and I'm not denying the viability or the significance of non-Jewish opposition to the state of Israel, particularly in the terms in which you have put it, but recognition that there is also a movement of resistance within the people who self-identify as Jews and with Jews, right? Against not only the idea of the ethno-national near-fascist state of Israel, but also of Jewish compradorism, whether it's in North Africa or in other parts of the world. I mean, as so well, at least described by Abourahme, right? And that's, I think, his great significance. Anti-Zionism has been a movement of opposition, a Jewish movement of opposition to Zionism from the minute that Zionism was conceived, anti-Zionism was conceived. And there are those of us who are staking our lives on the possibility of some kind of a viability to the blowing on the embers, on the flickering embers of that that Jewish politics and Jewish passion for a maintenance of a vibrant Jewish existence that will also strive, and I do not consider this a negative term, for an ethical existence in the world and commitment to what the Bund called Doigkeit, right? Commitment to exactly the here and now of where we are. And we don't need to take that here and now too literally, because obviously, in one literal sense, my here and now is Berkeley, California. But in a profound sense, my here and now is Ramallah and Gaza. So, let's not somehow, in articulating the broader political and moral significance of the struggle of the Palestinians, which is right now the single most acute boil that has to be somehow punctured, addressed. I'm going to say something really dangerous to me now, that while I am, like everybody I know, devastated at the fact that Donald Trump is going to be the next president of the United States, I am not sad that Kamala Harris is not going to be the next president of the United States. And I don't deny her virtues. I think I'm pretty close to finishing what I want to say at this moment. I'll just say that it's quite a number of years that people have asked me, why am I so concerned about Israel? Why am I so concerned with the, there are so many places in the world where one group of people are behaving devastatingly to another group of people. So why do I focus so much on Israel? I say because I'm Jewish, and a Jew has to be a Zionist, and the kind of Zionist that I am is an anti-Zionist. So at least there. That's all I'm going to say now. So thank you.
We have plenty of time for questions. I'm happy to start with one if we need to get the ball rolling. But yeah, to me, what was really enlightening is in both those presentations is the push to rethink the space-time of Zionism and anti-Zionism, the analogies, the comparison, the mutual formations. And to me, that focus on praxis, on the intolerability of life, it really, to me, begs the question of the layers of the Palestinian struggle and settler colonialism in Palestine. We often go back to 1948, but sometimes we tend to forget that perhaps the original sin was Sykes-Picot. And I'm wondering how those methodologies can help us rethink Sykes-Picot beyond Palestine, and how can Palestinian praxis be a revolutionary praxis, let's say in Syria and Lebanon, thinking about anti-sectarianism, or in Anatolia, thinking about anti-Turkism, and how can we cater to these conversations? So if you could speak to how does a decentering of the story of Jews and Palestinian can also open up more of a regional landscape that could, contribute to the region as a whole.
No.
Or we can take questions as well.
Yeah. Yeah? Yes. So let me try to answer that, and then maybe try to address some of Daniel's comments. Of course, the decentering Arab and Jew as these sort of figurations of alterity that I think we inherit from, as such, we inherit from Europe, and which becomes the focus of a lot of sort of criticism, a lot of it in the department I did my program in, so this is maybe why I have a gripe with this stuff. But I don't mean that to risk, what sometimes happens these days is that the struggle becomes a Palestinian Zionist struggle shorn of its Arab component. I think there is an Arab component. I think there is an Arab-Israeli conflict in that sense. So I think, I made the remark briefly about not de-regionalizing the terms of anti-Zionist praxis, because I think that there is something to be said there. There is something to be said both in the sort of traditions, the historical traditions, whether it's the Nahda or anything else, that might be a sort of resource for thinking about ways out, but also in the sense that if we're talking about concrete forces of struggle that are resisting Zionism, they also exist in the rest of the region. And that's a very disjunctural relationship full of geopolitical contradictions, but it's not also one that you can entirely ignore. Can anti-Zionism be a sort of name for a certain sort of resistance to the Balkanization of the region, Syria, Lebanon? I mean, it was for a very long time. It was, right? And it wasn't enough, though. And there's a historical question there to be had about why it wasn't enough and where it failed. But of course, Palestine was central to the dream and the vision of a unified regional space, pan-Arab, but not pan-Arab in a sort of chauvinistic sense, right? But it was central to that. Central to that vision, and it stuttered along the way in a history I think a lot of us know only too well. So I obviously there are terms there, but I think part of it involves reinterrogating that history and it's sort of where it fell off. In relation to Jewish anti-Zionism, yeah, I tried to say that's an important, rich, and long tradition, and it's an important critical front in the struggle today. You may have a claim for why it needs to be thought of in Jewish terms, and I think I don't think I would counter that. The only thing I would ask is if it is about the here and now, as you say, and that's what I tried to kind of gesture to. What are its terms of relation to the Palestinian struggle? I think that's where it kind of hinges. Interestingly, since everyone has brought up Memi, yet again, Memi, before his right-wing turn, and I agree with everything that's been said about that book, but there's an interesting thing in that book, which is that from his subject position as Tunisian Jew, he reads the anti-colonial fault line, he reads the struggle, he reads his slightly ambivalent place in it. But he concludes in that book, The Colonized and the Colonizer, he concludes that even though the victory of the national liberation struggle, since it has to garb itself, he says, in sort of Islamic terms, even though the victory of the national liberation struggle might make his place more tentative in a future Tunisia, he has to support it nonetheless. So the position he takes in that book, which again is before he kind of shifts rightwards, is that the national liberation struggle, even in its sort of particularity here that may not have an exact place for me, is something I have to subscribe to. And I think that's in a way, it's a bit ironic to say that the struggle is to live up to Memi, but at least to that Memi at some level, I think that's a kind of gauntlet.
Let me just quickly add. First of all, obviously, I think everything I've said makes clear that I consider unequivocal support for the Palestinian liberation struggle to be not only the primary, at this point, virtually the only focus of our politics as anti-Zionist Jews, right? And I very much fear that what you're saying is happening. That that there's a kind of liberal suddenly it's like in whatever horror that many Jews are feeling, there all of a sudden it's become cool to say, well, there was a country song, I was country when country wasn't cool. Anti-Zionism, in the sense of which I speak it, was a recognition of the disaster that the idea of a Jewish state would inevitably lead to. Secondly, and it's fascinating to me that Memi is becoming so significant here, at least for the moment, for this couple of hours of this morning's session. But the recognition of the Jews as comprador, and I'm going to be saying this at the AAR in a couple of weeks, the American Academy of Religion, but the the comparison to Mahmoud Mamdani's analysis of Rwanda, what happened in Rwanda, as a process that keeps taking place, where one group are defined as the good, and here and then they become precisely the functional group that enables the colonizer to more fully oppress the bad ones, right? So the Tutsi and the Hutu in Rwanda, after a year of absolute puzzlement, desperate puzzlement for why bloody Biden and the leaders of the UK and the leaders of Germany were unequivocally supporting genocide in Gaza and now Israel. Finally came to the conclusion it's because that is the extension of the European project of getting rid of Muslims, getting rid of Arabs, and which before World War II, we'll say roughly, right, Jews were associated, even European Jews were associated as together the bad others, have now been rehabilitated, but in the way that the Tutsi were rehabilitated by the Belgians in particular in Rwanda. So and in that sense, I completely sympathize with what you said about. So we can't ignore Europe. We can't ignore Europe, in that sense, because it is in some deep sense going back to the Reconquista in Spain, part of a project of getting rid of Muslims. Anyway, that's it.
Thank you so much for amazing presentations. I have a question building up on the Arab region, because I think I totally agree that anti-Zionism was not only central for Palestinians, but also for that front of Arabs, I could say. I remember on Tahrir Square, after fall of Mubarak, people were chanting for liberation for Palestine, so they liberated Egypt, now it's Palestine. But also now with all of the fall of the Arab Spring and with what's going on, there is a lot of questions, about would Gaza massacre genocide would be possible before Syria? If the amount of killing in Syria was not that much, if there was that silence, would Gaza would be that massive? And I'm questioning how the Zionist project in the region doesn't only affect Palestinians, but affects also other Arab regimes around, and also affects the subjectivity of the Arab person in the region in general. And I think especially this is on one side about the Arab regimes, but also on the other side about like activists or populations or or young people in the region currently, the figure of Sinwar and the way that he was killed and how he was portrayed, as really, I think, triggers a lot of existential questions, about who's really You know, a lot of says about what it to be Palestinian Arab at this current moment, and what that means in your relationship to the world, what it means if you are really opposing the world and the world is opposing you on that way, and what it means when really anti-Zionism is about practice. You know, as you said, like, you know, it's not like we can just sit and talk about decoloniality and blah, blah, blah. You really need to be doing something with it. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good and hard set of questions and provocations. I think in sort of in the long-term historical sense, in obvious terms, Zionism and the character of the politics of dissent and state politics in the Arab world have always been entangled in the modern period, right? It's exerted a kind of influence that's hard to measure and that is hard to overemphasize in terms of the shape that the politics of the region took. I think if we're thinking about the revolutionary period of the Arab, what gets called the Arab Spring or the Arab revolts, and it would be interesting to think of, you know, I think the counterfactual is, well, what would the resistance to the genocide have looked like had it happened before 2011, right, or around the same time as 2011? Because the story of 2011 is also the story of a massive regional counter-revolution, and a counter-revolution that has helped devastate the region. Of course, the grounds for which were laid in the invasion of Iraq in 2003. But I think part of what the genocide and part of what the arc of sort of armed struggle in the region has done, including the Al-Aqsa flood, is that it has crystallized those formations in a certain sense, right? But one of the interesting things, you know, you say that in Tahrir there was the chants about Palestine, and it's true, it was present, right? And there was the sort of siege of the Israeli embassy twice, but actually the reception of the Arab Spring by a lot of people on the left was that it bracketed the imperialist question, right? That it was really fundamentally about political freedom, right? About political rights, anti-police, and the social question was still there, although sometimes not as prominent. And there are obvious reasons for it. And all kinds of people think about the transformation of the left into a sort of into a more liberal formation, right? But the slogan was bread, freedom, social justice, right? And I think in a certain sense, what this period has done, and people can assess that in different ways, it has recrystallized the imperial question. And that's Zionism, but it's generally US-led imperialism in the region, right? Zionism and the House of Saud as the sort of twin poles of the regional counter-revolution. So I think there is a kind of, that imperial question has re-risen to the surface as inseparable from the question of political freedom and social justice. That doesn't make it any easier. It makes it infinitely harder at some level, right? But I think part of what marks the moment, part of what I tried to gesture to at the end, is that happens in the Arab world. It happens in the West. Part of what marks the moment in the West is a new internationalist consciousness. And what's important about the new internationalist consciousness that you can sort of read via an Arab Spring arc is that it understands those connections, right? It understands that there's a connection between ongoing settler colonialism and climate change. It understands that there's an ongoing connection between political violence dispensed in the name of imperialism and policing here. Right? Those connections begin to be made real, and in a certain sense, they're premised on the waning of empire as a wage, the waning of empire as a way of life, as a cultural form of self-identification. So there's an important connection there, I think, that we shouldn't lose sight of. I'm not sure I understood the thrust of the last part about the existentialism. There is something, sure, but it's also a slippery path. But there is something definitely existential. You can think about figurations of martyrdom or sacrifice that come to the fore of our sort of cultural and our lived political sort of grammar and realities now. And I think that's that's fundamental. But I think it's important to remember that these are the forms, right? They're the forms that the content of that contradiction takes. I think what is important is in the renewed consciousness of those connections. There can be no liberation of the Arab world without its liberation from anti-imperialism. There is no sort of political revolution or social revolution that will not be checked by, if you want to put it in stark geopolitical terms, by the Israeli state and Saudi Arabia. And squaring that circle somehow is the task.
We welcome any additional question. We have time.
Hi, thank you for the talks. My question was for Nasser. I found it very interesting what you said about what possibilities might be opened up if we move beyond or think outside this overdetermined entanglement between the Holocaust and the Nakba. And I was wondering if you thought that this also might help us move beyond or think outside a European concept of history. And if so, I was wondering if you had thoughts on what sorts of temporalities or concepts of history we might find if we take like you said, the rupture produced by Palestinian struggle as our starting point.
I don't know if it's a concept of history, but I think there is a time. I would think of it as a time, not necessarily as a sort of a historiographic concept. But there is a concept of time that bursts in. I think that's how I understand. I understand it as a kind of Palestinian time. And maybe Palestinian time is also always sort of waged against history in a certain sense. You could think of it that way. But that's how I would understand the radical forgetting of a Europe that is not a letting Europe off the hook. On the contrary, the radical forgetting of the Europe is to make sure Europe remains on the hook. Actually, in a certain sense, this is. I borrowed this also from Hurriya Boutelja's book "Whites, Jews, and Us," where she addresses Europe's Jews, she addresses France's Jews in effect, and she says, anti-Zionism is the name for the end game. It's the name for the end game, and it's the territory, it's the primary site on which we face, and she creates a we there, we face the actual architect, right? It's a chance, she tells them, for you to identify your real enemy. So yes, absolutely, outside, like, forget, but it is not letting off the hook. In fact, it's the contrary. And I wouldn't think of that as another concept of history. I would think of it as an opening of a sort of unoccupied Palestinian time.
I have a question. I guess I have two questions, actually, one to each panelist, but they both relate to the kind of same topic, which is Islam. Something I was just kind of thinking of as you both were giving us these very lovely, insightful talks. So for Nasser, I just want to hear a bit from you about, specifically in relation to this idea of praxis in an intolerable world. What role does Islam play in that, in your opinion? And how does Islam determine both? Like, does praxis play a role in the Palestinian, an Islamic articulation of the Palestinian struggle? And does Islam also play a role in their articulation of an intolerable world? And then for sorry, I lost my train of thought.
Daniel.
My second question. Oh yes, Professor Boyarin.
Daniel.
You spoke about the Jewish anti-Zionist tradition, and you sort of, for lack of a better term, self-identified as part of that. I'm wondering how you see that tradition's response to an Islamic anti-Zionism? How does it place it? How would it articulate it? How does it see itself in relation to it? Yeah.
Let me try to address. Thank you for the question. Let me try to address it quickly. Do I see it in both? Well, yeah, you can see it in both for sure. I mean, if you think of Islam as a discursive tradition, as this grammar, there's nothing predetermined, right? Islam can produce the House of Saud, or it can produce, anti-colonial resistance. It's not set. I think when I talk about anti-colonial praxis, I'm not trying to sort of sideline the Islamist or the Islamic component of that. My read, the way I would think about that, is that Islam provides the form and not the content. It provides the form and not the content of these movements. But that's not to say form is unimportant. Form is crucial. The content of these movements is, I think, anti-colonial national liberation, the movements that I have in mind. The form they take is Islamic, of course, and it gives them a world of reference, but again, a world of reference that's not just particular to Islam. Notions of sacrifice and martyrdom, you hear them today and you think, oh my God, the Muslims are coming, but they don't exist only in political Islam. Try listening to Bella Ciao, right? The great internationalist leftist anthem. Right? What is Bella Ciao about? When people sing it it's on Netflix shows. Bella Ciao is a song of martyrdom, right? He's saying, I'm going to die, bury me on the mountain next to the pretty flowers, so that people can pass by and see the sacrifice that I made. Right? The leftist canon, third worldist and Western, is full of this content, right? So I don't think the elevation of sacrifice and martyrdom is specific or particular to Islam. I think it's specific or particular to the nature of the contradiction and the odds that you face. That's why I tried to say the challenge of the anti-colonial subject, especially in Palestine, since I think in Palestine you are at some level facing the world itself. That's why I tried to say Zionism is integral to a global ideological Western-led order that exceeds Israel. Israel may fall tomorrow, and Zionism will carry on in the West as a civilizational, form. So the question then is what are the resources from which you can fashion a subject that can face this insurmountable odd? So of course sacrifice, martyrdom, the giving of oneself become integral to that. And in the Shi'i and other non-Shi'i traditions, that's drawn from the mythology that exists there, as it has to be, right? But it's not, it's not the content. It's a vitally important piece of the form. So that's how I would think about it, and that's how I would say. That's how I would say you can relate it to a whole world that is actually the world of the left that precedes it. It's not really particular to that.
First of all, I again resonate with what you said about the form and the content. That it's Islam becomes already in the Middle Ages a name for the other, the enemy, not the other, the enemy of European Christendom. Just have to go to churches, medieval churches to already see Muhammad, the prophet, in grotesque, caricatured statuary, etc. Right next to the blinded, weeping synagogue. Also, so Islam is a kind of a figure, which itself, I think, is protean in the sense of what you're saying. In other words, not only in what Muslims do with it, make of it, but also as a kind of figure for the enemy of Europe. It's not an accident that even now, 800 years of Spanish culture, of culture made in Spain, are practically excised from even our curricula. Already I observed this 30 years ago, 25, 30 years ago, where you have these surveys of the West, Western thought, Western civilization, whatever they were called then. They notoriously were Greece, Rome, and then a jump to Italy, and Spain was practically the chanson de Roland. I mean, was not acceptable. So I think that this is a massive project that has taken shape in the last couple of hundred years in the form of colonialism, and the anti-colonial decolonizing analysis is vital for understanding it, and understanding is vital for combating it, and that's where I say that we who think and write we're at least auxiliaries in this fight. So yeah. So Islam is the name of something. Whether it has an essence or not is not my place to know. But I look at it, or to say. But when I see how it functions in discourse, from the highest level of, I'm just going to talk about the United States, but I think it's equally true in other parts of Europe, from the highest levels to the lowest forms of discourse. I was talking about Hamas in the last year, talking to people, and you say it's a political movement. Say it's a resistance movement, not in the context of justifying a particular massacre or not, but simply understanding Hamas. No. I mean, when they're willing to talk to me at all, right? No. It's an Islamist, religious, fanatical, whatever. Yeah. Anyway, Islam is the enemy. That's why.
At the risk of Hello. At the risk of interpolating myself, I'll say first that I'm kvelling here to be listening to and learning from Nasser Abourahme and Daniel Boyarin on the same stage. At the risk of interpolating you two now, I will bring up two questions that I would invite you both to comment on. It may wind up being a bit more of a rambling disquisition, partly because what is being staged here is precisely one of the core features, I hope, that will ring out of this event, namely an attempt to decenter this complex, which Nasser, I think, was touching on to great effect, one that presumes some kind of pre-existing and separate conceptual frameworks, political movements, forms of identity, and other that can be reducible to things called, and they have been called, Jewish anti-Zionism, Palestinian anti-Zionism, and then, sadly, other anti-Zionisms, internationalist, Marxist, whatever we would like to call them. So by frame, I mean, could you each reflect on these frames in terms of both their limitations and perhaps their generative possibilities? One interesting dimension that I would just flag as a provocation, but it's not the only way to think about this question, I would argue, is the kind of remainder that is left over in the space created by both Jewish and what I understand Nasser to be saying about Palestinian anti-Zionism, namely figures or figurae of the Jew, of the Palestinian, which is not quite assimilable to either one of those discursive formations. So why is it that we keep returning wonder of wonders to Al-Bermemi and the Arab Jew as the figure, if it is one, thanks thee alone, it is not one. So the question of the frame I find really important here, and I think we're going to continue to talk about it, so I flag it for our purposes collectively of thinking together. And then the question of form, which came to mind thinking through Daryl's comment about the poverty of analogy as a method for thinking and analysis, came through quite clearly and beautifully in Nasser's remarks, but also in Daniel's, I think, intriguing defense of Doikite. And so I just wanted to ask you to consider with me, as I am racing through this in my mind, the relation between what Nasser refers to as immanence, or immanent critique, and Doikite itself. There's something kind of interesting about the conditions of possibility for thinking immanence in perhaps a Jewish fashion, and thinking Doikite in a non or even an anti-Jewish fashion. So what does that leave us with? Are we talking about an analogy? Is immanence deracinated Doikite? Is Doikite a culturalized form of universal or universalizing vision of presence, politics, what Nasser calls praxis? This seems to me to be a kind of knotted set of problems, a nexus of some kind that I think you two are eminently placed to give some thoughts on. So I hope some of that is clear, and thank you.
Yeah. Well, at the risk of, in the end, summarizing the paper I was meant to give, but I'm just going to do it very quickly. For me, the connection between the Bund and Doikite, right? There where I live, that is my homeland, was Do, for there where I live, there is my homeland, and now. But by itself, Doikite would be sort of an empty term for me, at any rate. Perhaps, not meaningless, but because despite the fact that at least two speakers this morning associated diasporism with cosmopolitanism, diasporism stands in opposition to cosmopolitanism. Diasporism stands in opposition to cosmopolitanism. It is not about, it is not about my wife's great aunt refusing to send birthday presents to her nephews and nieces because she loves all the children of the world, right? It's about, if I had the guts, I would write a book called Dual Loyalty, right? It's precisely about the making of dual loyalty, a loyalty which is local, and I extended local to mean Palestine as my locale also, in a sense, and a loyalty to 2,000 years of a culture, of its practices, of its literature, of its songs and its dances, and its evil also, as a significant and vibrant locus of resistance to the globalization of culture which makes everything look, cosmopolitanism is ultimately, finding a McDonald's everywhere, right? I'm speaking crudely, of course. I think that is enough. So it's these two forces, right? The force of commitment to continuation of a culture and its vibrant and ethical possibilities, and a equally or maybe even necessarily more significant commitment to justice in the world. That's the dough. Yeah. Did that help? Did that address what you were saying at all? Yeah.
These are some hard questions, Max, by the way. I think they touch on the core of some of what's at stake here. So the question of figuration, I think part of my hesitancy is it's both the abstraction that the figuration entails, but also the figures themselves that are incited in the sort of, the relational ethics of a certain strand of, shall we say, anti or post-Zionism. And I think part of what I wanted to sort of emphasize in contrast was, and what I tried to index with the notion of a subject position is, I don't think a subject position is a figuration. I think a subject position is a material relationship to racial structure, to violence, to premature deaths. So I think those are very different things. And I think the figuration Arab Jew is an abstraction that removes us from the concrete material position that is, the Palestinian sitting under the drone or the F-35 2,000-pound bomb. That's not a figuration. That's a concrete reality. How this relates to analogy and form, I need to think about a little bit more. I think we somehow share a hesitancy or a suspicion of analogy these days. I'm not sure we can do without analogy entirely. I think, there are moments I've found myself in this period reaching for analogy, right? Especially when it comes to political violence, anti-colonial political violence in Palestine. There's a powerful move, I think, whether it's Nat Turner or Toussaint Louverture and the Haitian Revolution or the FLN in Algeria, right? Imperfect, imperfect sort of like analogies always, but the analogy is always imperfect, that I think have a certain power now, right? Because they help us de-exceptionalize. They help us to sort of get past the contemporary quarantine that Palestine and its forms are subject to all the time, right? That this is a sort of somehow unfathomable, the Al-Aqsa flood, October 7th, was the Holocaust recast, right? Which is, of course, itself an analogy. Nonetheless, that recourse to analogy has a certain pitfalls, right? Has certain risks because analogy is promiscuous, as I just sort of demonstrated. It's subject to a kind of warping, right? It moves, it travels. You can think of New York legislators coming out and saying, masked protesters are the Ku Klux Klan of our day on the streets of New York. That's an analogy. I think without letting go of analogy entirely, the counter to analogy is relation, in my idea, right? It's the relation. The FLN, even the histories of Nat Turner, somehow, if you really get into the coloniality of modernity, are not simply analogies, right? They are, even if we stretch the term, relational histories at some level. I think the recourse to relation and kinship is a kind of a counter to the danger, the promiscuousness of analogy.
So we have time for one more question, but actually want to fit two in there. So we'll take them both together, perhaps.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. I'm asking this question with a great deal of trepidation because Daniel's on the stage, but I wanted to ask how much of the question about escape, or at least refusing or rejecting this sort of Western absolute and the terms of engagement that it presents, how much we need to still think about Derrida's argument of mondial latinisation, that the world is still fundamentally a Christian concept. And globalization, or mondial latinisation, still means Christianization. And I'm going to quote quickly. Christian discourse confusedly but surely informs this doxa and all that it carries with it, beginning with the world and the names for its mundiality and its vague equivalents, globe, universe, earth, or cosmos in its Pauline uses. So I guess my question is, given that the bulk of Zionist presence is not necessary, in terms of sheer numbers, is not Jewish, it's Christian, and that it's located largely in the global south, and it's a population that's gone from around 16 million in 1960 to 600 million at the turn of the 20th century. And you can find now, a so-called replica of Solomon's Temple outside of Rio de Janeiro, and Nigerians who are going on pilgrimages to Jerusalem, sponsored by their states. And so I'm curious about is this a matter also of the deconstruction of Christianity, as Nancy argues, to which Derrida responds, the deconstruction of Christianity will always be a Christian victory? And how much do we need a new concept of, how much what is lacking is a concept of world that can be worked with?
Just pass on the mic in front of you, exactly.
Hi, thank you both for these lovely papers. I wanted to follow on the analogy part, Nasser, but first compliment you on both two moves that I thought were very important, putting Palestine in the context of the world rather than the constant relation to Judaism and its history. And then one of the last points you made about Islam as a form, I thought that was very useful. And then I want to kind of go back to Kanafani and the question of analogy, because, when you hear him speak in interviews or when he writes essays, things are very abstract, and he talks about, anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism, and the Palestinian struggle is put in that context. But then when he writes Returning to Haifa, there's content to the colonizers that Saeed and Sophia meet. And I think that content matters. And this entire digression through the Holocaust story of Miriam, matters, and the fact that they come from Europe seems to matter. Like he tells a really long story there. So, following on my particular talk, I was wondering what you think about this entire European backstory, and now not pretending, that was the question, and I'm not going to pretend it's a question, it's more of a comment, and that's the part of the analogy. I think, one of the reasons for the invocation of the Holocaust in that particular context is precisely to dismiss the ongoing analogy between the Holocaust and the Nakba. He's actually showing that Miriam's incapacity to view the Nakba as nothing but, she's only able to see it in analogous terms, and that's why she doesn't get it. That's why she stays, even though she considers leaving. So it is kind of an indictment of analogy in that sense, and that particular analogy that we are all very tired of it, So I thought there's a treatment of analogy in the text you mentioned, and that just seemed helpful. And Daniel, I was wondering whether your ideas in the book, was there any aspect of them that you reconsidered following, the current war? And then again, my criticism of diasporism is not, I don't think it's cosmopolitanism, but I do think that what is shared, that I cannot see anything that is shared that is not rights and scriptures. That is not rights and scriptures. So the dances you mentioned, the daily practices, the languages, the cooking, the humor, it's not really shared between different Jewish communities across the world. So that it, that dual, the second thing of not being in the place you are, but the other thing, the thing that is Jewish, what is it when it's not a religious practice, if all the rest of it is not shared, if people dance different dances in Kurdistan than they would, So that's my point.
Thank you. Well, we're already 5 minutes over time, but I'm all for pushing a little further. Yeah. No pain, no gain.
Okay, just to the last point, and I'm trying to do it in one sentence. It is the way that all of those cultural forms come out of shared practice. In other words, the shared texts, the shared language of Hebrew, the shared stories that we tell about ourselves. There is so much, I think, that actually speaks against what you're saying, which is not a call for homogeneity at all, right? But recognition of that underlying structural possibility. The Talmud is not scripture. The Talmud is not a religious book. I mean, it's obviously a book that it was produced in a religious world. But there, and just to give that as my primary example, and that kind of vibrancy, the vibrancy that allowed a Moroccan or a Kurdish Jew, even, to come to Poland, and there are, somehow find themselves very naturally in. I don't want to sound Pollyannish. I mean, I recognize all the struggle and all the problems, but there's something valuable that I don't want to let go of.
So I'll also try to be very brief with regards to the two questions. Kanafani, yes. The digression to Miriam, yes. Miriam is a reluctant participant in the project, but a participant nonetheless. I think you're right. I mean, I don't think I would say. I didn't think about it as an indictment of analogy there. I thought about it in the terms of entanglement. But of course, the entanglement is analogical, although it can also have this historical. But the historical is much harder to deal with because the sequence doesn't favor that reading. Let's just put it that way. So of course, I think I think Kanafani takes that digression not just to give, as I said, that kind of the richness and the complexity to the subject, which he does, but also to move beyond that and beyond that sort of analogy or the entanglement. The encounter is a failed encounter. It's the staging of a failed dialogue, as you know all too well. So it's that becomes the set, not for, oh my God, they're so, I'm not going to name names, but they're so entangled as to, become indistinguishable to the point of collapse. No, not really. Sorry. It's the imperative of something else, right? That's the other thing. The other question is there a non-Christian, non-Western worlding? Yeah, of course there is. I mean, decolonization was the name, I think, precisely for that worlding. Third worldism incites a world. The reference of, and I think that what I'm trying to say is that in a certain sense, that impulse and that address and that mode of incitement exists in the resistance today, right? When they address Ahrar al-Alam, for example, the free peoples of the world, that is an address at the level of the world, right? I've already invoked Sinwar here, so I'm already doomed. And B'nai Brit are already, they kindly shared my article, so I might as well go the whole way. But in the discourse, let me just say that in that discourse, right? If you read Sinwar's will and testament, his final will and testament, Palestine is almost a stand-in in that testament. It's almost a stand-in for a worlding process, right? For another worlding process. So I think there are absolutely these counter-worldings that exist up there, right? But what I tried to get at the tension in the Palestinian case is it comes out of a kind of worldlessness at the same time, That's what's interesting, and I think what's powerful.
Well, thanks to our speakers, I think we are over time, but we'll break for an hour, have lunch, I guess, and we'll meet here again at 2:30 after lunch.
Thank you, Daniel. I really enjoyed it.